for some background, this is our 9th meeting, and we are coming together to align data, policy, practice, and workforce and economic development to build a community of practice and purpose among organizations and people working in the green economy. Jobs First is playing the role of convener and facilitator to support stakeholders in determining and deciding what a green economy network will be. You all will drive it. In the last meeting, we discussed the New York City Cleanup Corps. And if anyone has updates since we last met, please go ahead and share those in the chat. And in the last meeting, we also spent a good portion of time sharing back the results of goals and working groups prioritization as chosen by all of you, voting and weighing in and allocating points to things in a survey that if you have not had an opportunity to fill in, we can share in the chat now for those of you who have not had that opportunity. And today we are going to look closely at these things that you voted on, the working groups, the vision statement. Sorry, I'm losing my voice also. Next slide, please. So there has been a membership form that we've shared multiple times, and we want to make sure that anyone who is interested in filling that in and hasn't, if you don't see your logo on here, we don't have a feedback from your organization in that membership survey. So we'd love to have you fill that in and incorporate you into the assets. That's where they're really kind of collecting what are the assets of the network. Next slide. So we are in the Jobs First process of the 5 I's, which is not on here directly, but these are all elements of what goes on in those 5 I's. We are in the imagine phase, which is the phase that comes after investigate. Although we continue to investigate of the Jobs First process, designing the partnership. And in the next month and a half or so, as working groups meet, structures to act on the shared vision and goals and to achieve targets will be brainstormed, ideated, and agreed. Next slide. So I'm not going to go through this because it's in the participant agenda and on the slide here, but these are things that we've accomplished. I'll just touch on a few. We have a problem definition and we've done some baseline data analysis, identified opportunities for alignment, and we have really spent time on the priority goals and working groups most recently, and drivers and long-term plans. Next slide. So in this meeting, participants will understand and discuss pertinent federal, state, and local legislation. We will examine final versions of previously voted upon priority goals and expand and finalize the Green Economy Network vision statement, review working groups and the current makeup of those working groups, and join if you haven't. And we will re-examine partnership models and design a Green Economy Network partnership model. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the moment where we make sure you can access the participant agenda. If that link can be shared in chat and everyone click on it where it says participant agenda that Amanda shared, and make sure you can access it. On the 3rd page, there's a contact list of all the people who registered by probably midnight last night or so. If you registered after that or this morning and don't see your name, please add it at the bottom. You could add rows to the table if needed. And let me know in chat if you cannot access the participant agenda through that link. Okay, next slide. So for today, we're going to have some discussion and presentation on the Civilian Climate Corps and federal and local workforce policy. We're going to review the priority goals and vision statement, as we talked about, and the working groups, and work on partnership model design in breakout and group discussions, and then look at our action items and close the meeting. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Elizabeth Shepard, the co-founder and strategy consultant with Green City Force.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here today. I want to shout out Green City Force's new Chief Program Officer, Anel, who is somewhere on this. Hello, Anel. And our Executive Director, Tanya, who many of you know, is in jury duty, so sadly can't be here. But I'm delighted to be here to share an update about the CCC. So on January 27th, President Biden established a Civilian Climate Corps initiative, and I'm going to quote it to get it right, to mobilize the next generation of conservation and resilience workers and maximize the creation of accessible training opportunities and good jobs. And this order calls for the delivery of a strategy to the Climate Task Force by April 2021 to be carried out within existing appropriations, which is really important. So we wanted to share an update about the CCC for this with this group for a few reasons. So first of all, obviously this is a major initiative to create jobs in our sector, but also multiple proposals include a green or climate careers network that really mirrors the spirit of what we're trying to do in our group here in New York City. And then finally, in past meetings, as Carrie recapped, of meetings of this group, there has been talk about a climate corps here in New York City. Michaela Crater of SBS shared, plans or aspirations to build on the cleanup corps and build forward into having a climate corps for New York City. And then other cities around the country like LA and Austin have already moved to create a CCC at the city level without waiting for a federal program to be in place. So with that, just giving a little update so we can sort of all follow along and then discuss. The recommendations were delivered, but the administration has not yet announced its plans. There are multiple bills in the Senate and House regarding a CCC. Ed Markey's and AOC's proposals build off of a proposal by the Evergreen Action Network, which I think I'd asked be included in the materials. So I haven't checked. Thank you, Carrie. They're included in the materials, so you can see their whole plan there. And that plan includes the recommendation to create a national green careers network. There's a bill by Senators Chu and Panetta, Representatives Chu and Panetta, that also includes a CCC with a climate careers network that I think they're envisioning as a database and kind of a coordinating body nationally. Then there are also recommendations that I included that Carrie put in the materials from the core network. And I don't know how much this group knows about the core network, but they're a national network of existing conservation corps, and Green City Force is a member. And they're kind of under the radar, but they've been around for decades. And these existing conservation corps exist in rural communities and urban communities, on public lands, like GCF is not all on public lands, but we're focused in public housing. So there's a wide range out there. And so TCN, as the core network, as is referred to, has been fighting for some specific things that I wanted to elevate for young people in EJ communities to be prioritized for recruitment, raising AmeriCorps stipends. A lot of these programs are AmeriCorps and non-AmeriCorps. So raising AmeriCorps stipends to align with minimum wage, which would be a really big deal. And for cities as well as public lands to be areas of focus. A lot of the kind of nostalgia for the CCC immediately assumes that it's about, working in public lands, but there's so much that needs to be done in cities. And so really, fighting for those mechanisms to be put in place so that cities and groups in cities can access the funds, in particular frontline communities. So finally, funding for the CCC is going to be determined through reconciliation. So the timeline for that, I think now is expected to be August 13th for that to be resolved. And it could fall between $10 billion and $60 billion. The latter is Senator Sanders' number that he's working towards on the Budget Committee. And in terms of implementation, AmeriCorps is seen as a way to begin implementing rapidly, but there are a lot of questions and issues about whether these changes to AmeriCorps could actually be enacted, in the short term. So that is the update, and there's so many questions. I've listed a whole bunch of questions, but I think mainly I just wanted to, on behalf of this group, sort of put this information out there, and then hopefully this is something that we could come back to as a group in the multiple times in the future, because it's an exciting prospect. Thank you.
And did folks have any questions for Elizabeth before we turn it over to Marjorie? I don't see any hands raised, but you could feel free to unmute yourself.
Liz, I have a question. Can you speak to how, if what you just laid out gets approved, how does that play out across New York City for young people in New York City?
Yeah. Well, this is actually the big question mark, like at the top of my questions I'd listed, but so holding back a little because I don't want to monopolize this whole meeting with the answers we would get into. But this is really the top question, Marjorie, I think, is like, there aren't mechanisms set up yet to ensure that money like this in a new program would flow. Like, that isn't set up yet, how it would flow to cities. And so there are different scenarios for that, but I think this is like, the focus has been like with the advocacy groups, et cetera, has been on the price tag. But I think this, there needs to be this shift to how is that money actually going to flow down to groups and cities, to cities. So, concretely under existing, if something has to happen under existing appropriations, it's like groups that already have accounts with federal agencies are going to be the ones who will be able to most easily access the funds. I think there's the issue of the flow of money, but the other implication is that, jobs will be created, which is great. What's the nature of those jobs? The significance of this careers network piece, I think, is that the notion of a core is sort of by definition like a short-term thing, but how does that relate then to longer term, advancing along a career path? So having this mechanism in place, at least to get ahead of this question, the rhetoric around union, like a lot of the rhetoric is like, the CCC will create lots of union jobs. But that doesn't really square with the idea of a core being probably more short-term work. And so there has to be room in there for a way to embrace both. How could there be rungs along the ladder that are supported through a CCC? So I think for New York City, it means hopefully, money, jobs, some galvanizing, hopefully around the chance to work together and in concrete ways. I'm hoping that there'll be money for like iconic projects, like big green public works projects, and then we could all come together very tangibly as a focal point, to be able to see how these things could play out. Thank you for that question. And over to you, Marjorie.
Good. Thank you for that, Liz. And I'm always inspired when I listen to you, just knowing how long you've been working in the green space, as the name has evolved over time, sustainability space, resiliency space, to have the level of attention that we're now seeing, and the opportunity to influence the decisions being made, the investments being made, is, it's like right there at the tip of your fingers. You can feel it, just you want to be able to lock it in now. So, we're there with you 100%, knowing that you've been on this journey much longer than some of us. But I'm going to speak a little bit to you more around, less around the green economy and more around what we've been working on from the youth end, with around, connecting to the American Jobs Plan and trying to figure out how we collaborate with others to influence the carve out and the investment that is going to be made into youth workforce development, which also connects to the work that Civilian Climate Corps and that group of advocacy and policy experts are really trying to get that embedded and signed off on. We know, just from following up on Liz's conversations, that it's not in the current bill, as was noted, that initially got signed off and sent to Congress. But we did talk with some of with Hakeem Jeffries' office around them prioritizing its inclusion, and they shared with us that they were going to pivot to it in August. Liz is working more closely with that, so she'll have down the road more information around some of that. So from us, the lessons that we learned from the last recession was that young people are at the back of the line, and that we really need, to this point, bold solutions that focus on the populations typically get left behind when you have these great economic disruption, but combined with historical factors that have been, each time you have this disruption, you pile on to the things that were already in place that were preventing economic mobility. I heard someone say recently that young people should be too big to fail and need large investments. And I support that. I really love that folks are thinking that way, and that we need to put specific budgets for programs for youth in any federal recovery plans, and it needs to build a political momentum around it. One thing that we talk about a lot is how are we as a group and as a city, we're often very focused on what's happening locally, but how we advocating at the state level and at the federal level to make sure that the carve-outs, the ideas, the types of programs we think should be invested in, that we're intervening and participating in the places that are having the greatest influence on making those things happen. So what we have been doing at Jobs First is working with a national coalition of youth employment groups and calling for the inclusion of an equity-centered national subsidized employment program in the American Jobs Plan. And we, I have a link here. Carrie, I link you to my document, and there's a link under just the stuff I'm talking about that you could click into the chat for me. So we want a permanent national year-round subsidized job opportunity initiative for young people across the country. We're asking for an investment of $45 billion in federally subsidized employment that would serve typically as a down payment, and what we think needs to happen to begin to redress and address some of the long-standing inequities. And then to help build career pathways that emphasize integrated education and training, prioritizing youth and young adults. So those are what the larger focus of our national work is on at the moment. There are two bills that are being floated now, one by Representative Chuy Garcia out of Ohio, Illinois District 4, called Connecting Youth to Jobs Act. And he's asking for $10 billion investment into subsidized employment. And there's a second bill called the Jobs for Economic Recovery Act, and that one is by Representative Danny Davis. These two is out of Illinois, it's out of Illinois 7. And those two bills are the ones that we've been kind of coordinating around because it has gained some traction. There's a larger group being coordinated by the Opportunity Youth United. There's about 100 plus folks who are signed on, which is really calling for an office inside the White House that is specifically developed and focused on youth, not the stuff that they traditionally have, but and not the community engager titles that they've traditionally thrown around, but one that is deeply knowledgeable about what's happening with young people across the country, that can influence policies inside the White House. You know, in the American jobs plan, the President Biden just put a $50 million line in the Department of Labor's budget for summer youth employment, for example. Some of that came out of some of the work that folks have been doing on the ground. We think will have greater impact if there's an office, a standing office inside the White House, fully staffed, that is able to influence and create an agenda from inside the White House around some of these things. So we're also working with some groups around that. We'll make sure that gets into the links that Kerry will send out afterwards. You know, the American Jobs Plan, you know, the US ranks like near last of OECD countries for investment in workforce development as a percentage of GDP. So making any type of big, bold investment like the $45 billion that we said should be invested into subsidized employment could go a long way towards increasing, you know, long-term and longer on-ramps for building skills and for a strong economy. And again, redressing some of the economic disparities that we see. And so this $100 billion, you can see it's already a struggle, right? They've split it up as they try to get different parts through, and it's going to be a fight to get all of it through. So the questions that I think we ought to be thinking about is like, what federal legislation should this group be supporting? Should New York City be supporting and advocating for, you know, as there are usually resources that come to the city, and oftentimes New York City is missing at the table on these federal conversations. And how are all the different actors? The subsidized employment group that is a part of some of the climate core groups, that there's so many groups working on advocating for youth employment and workforce and investment in these long-term core programs. How is everyone working together? You know, how are these groups meeting to really align agenda so that they can leverage voice and advance some of what we're talking about here? And lastly, what should this group be lending its voice to collectively? The Civilian Climate Corps, Conservation Corps piece has been taken out of the first round of what is being submitted. A question for us is there a way for us to lend our voice to, as a group, to coordinate across New York City, to get folks to sign on to something to say, we support this being put back in, and to some of the things that Liz just shared, that those are the things that we're supporting, is a question that we should ask. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about, I don't know how much time I have, Carrie, so you probably have to tell me stop.
Yeah, just a minute or two.
Okay, in New York City, there's a complex workforce development system spanning 21 agencies, 75 publicly funded programs that provide a range of services from job, counseling and placement, to credentialing, to subsidized work opportunities. That system is supplemented by approximately $75 million in private funding for workforce development. Understanding the funds spent on workforce development is like a critical first step in developing end recovery program and making recommendations around New York City. And so, we're going to be putting out a paper in a few weeks that maps the workforce development system here in New York City that really captures all the investment up to 2019. And now we can compare it to the 2022 budget, and the 2020, up to 2021, we can compare it to the 22 budget. But it helps us to see where the money, what agencies the money exists in, and what programs they are funding. The governor recently announced a $76 million set aside for youth workforce and for at-risk youth. How that money is going to be carved out or spent on workforce development is something that we can still influence. And so we really should be talking to our legislators and state legislators, our Department of Labor folks, around how we want some of that money to be spent. Otherwise, you're going to wake up one day and you'll hear that money was distributed and you didn't have a say in how it happened. So I'm going to stop there.
That's perfect. Perfect time to stop, Marjorie. Thank you.
All right.
I know Marjorie shared a lot, and we will follow up with the links that she's referencing. But if anyone has questions now or has additional things to share that you've been watching on new plans, policies rolling out relevant to both what Elizabeth and Marjorie talked about, we welcome you to share your insight or ask questions. All right. Well, then we will move on if there are no questions. Thanks again, Elizabeth and Marjorie. And I think, Dave, you are up next.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk for a little bit about goals and priority goals. And for some of you who are newly joining us or weren't around for the last session, I'm going to do a bit of a recap. So when we talk about goals, we're often using them interchangeably with result and outcome to label the condition of well-being for children, adults, families, or communities. So over the past, actually multiple sessions, we've discussed broadly and specifically some of the goals that we want Jen to tackle medium and long term, and unsurprisingly, there were many goals that came up. So we did a survey to try to prioritize some of the top goals that we can focus on to really make things happen soon. So if we advance to, let's see, slide 16, then we can start to see some. So many of you, dozens of you participated in the Survey Monkey. And so some of you have already seen something that looks like this about how many participants prioritized this particular goal, what the percentage of responses and weight were. And short version, after that, there were a few goals that were very evidently a bit above the rest or a lot above the rest in terms of how much priority people thought they should receive. This was a big one: develop employer partnerships to broadly increase opportunity, understand industry needs, develop training. After we prioritized the surveys, we asked people for feedback so that we could incorporate even more detail or nuance into the goals to make sure that they both covered the entire range of what the network feels is important, and so that in the specific way in which the goal might be executed, we were getting that feedback as well. So if we go to the next slide, we can just see some examples of the kind of feedback that we got for just this one goal, which with almost all of the goals covered a broad range from, for example, I agree, no changes whatsoever, to, as you can see, some of these, very big changes about going beyond what one group can meet or the individual types of segments of the New York City landscape that maybe should get additional focus. So several of us tried to look at all the feedback and incorporate it down to see how we could get that feedback in while not making it that any of these goals were so all-encompassing that we could better discuss that additional feedback within the sessions where we will talk about how to turn goals into reality. So if we go to time, let's just go ahead to slide number 22, where you can see some of the updated priority goals. So based upon the feedback, we end up with 3 top goals, and here you'll see them called 1, 2, 3, and 3, 9, 6, based upon how they were originally numbered in the order. From here on out, we'll just call them the top 3 goals. But in case any of you are looking back at that survey and you're like, oh, I thought it was this other number, just to make sure we're aligned. So I'm just going to read these all aloud just because I want us all to really think about what they mean. And especially if we are making these important goals, then it should be something that we are saying to others and they'll get it. And then a bit later, we will talk about the goals and people can say how they think that these goals translate to the some specific targets that the Gen will work on. So develop formal employer partnerships to increase economic opportunities for priority populations, understand industry needs and priorities, align partners by sector, and develop market trainings. So some of the feedback here was about increasing the level of formality and the way that we split up the kind of partnerships to make sure that we are both very clear about the expectations, but also very clear about who can provide the most direct kind of, or most valuable kind of assistance based upon their own segments. Examples were given about solar and wind versus other kinds of sub-industries where people can, based upon their strengths, focus and help the most. Determine which standardized government investments into green economy careers would help most and advocate for them directly or indirectly. Second part being thinking about how it is that the network can most effectively and most efficiently advocate for the kind of changes that we will determine to be most useful, whether it's in the public sector, in the private sector, whether it's locally, whether it's federally. And number 3, establish replicable, scalable paths for job seekers to understand and enter quality career paths, including short-term to long-term transition, through retraining for green career paths while sharing employer pathways between network partners. Network partners will collaborate to establish shared hiring referral pathways to target employers. Here, that second sentence, the feedback is especially useful there in expanding the goal to really capture how it is that the job seekers and the people coming in to train or retrain, how it is that they will actually connect between the network and employers and connect within the network. So that's also very important. We go ahead to the next slide. So some of you participated previously in a activity using driver diagrams. For those who didn't, these are tools that display the goal along with primary and secondary drivers connected to achieving that goal. And we will be taking the priority goals that we collectively settled upon and turning them into targets, which are more measurable goals that essentially say, okay, here's the general goal that we have. The target is how do we actually put that into something that we measure with numbers or with a specific policy rule or with a specific system that comes into existence, something to that effect. So on the next slide, see some key definitions about primary and secondary drivers. This is mostly self-explanatory. The primary drivers are that big thing that really makes it, that drives the entire system of mini system of what you're looking at within the goal and target. And those secondary drivers are just subparts of making it so that each of those subdrivers will be necessary to achieve the goal as a whole, but none of them in and of itself reflects the overall system or overall target that you're looking at. So if we look at the next slide, looking at goal number 1 as an example, and some of the primary and secondary drivers that teams put together last time. Now, of course, none of this is set in stone. The idea is that while the goals, priority goals, have been established, that the individual groups within GEN will take over these goals, turning them into actual targets, discussing the best way that those targets could be achieved, and then presenting that to the network as a whole so that we can figure out the most efficient way of turning all of our plans and rhetoric into reality. So very likely some of these primary drivers and secondary drivers will change once members split up into those groups. And we're going to talk more about that later. But this is just a quick recap for some of you and a quick overview for some of you who have not necessarily seen these before. So if we go to the next slide, again, it's going to be the same thing. I'm not going to spend too much time looking at the next one because we, again, will look at this in more detail a bit afterwards, but want to make sure that everyone has a strong sense of how we obtain the priority goals, how we will plan to turn goals into targets, and what we plan to do with targets once we actually have those targets finalized within subgroups. And if we go to the next slide. Perfect. So I won't say too much more about that now because we are going to spend a bit talking about the vision statement, something that we had a draft for, but I will let Carrie talk about where the vision statement goes from here.
Thank you, Dave. Roman, if you could go to the next slide. So in that same survey where Dave was reviewing the feedback to the goals, we also asked for your feedback to the vision statement that we have been kind of repeating since the start of our coming together. And that statement is, we are working to build consistent career paths to good jobs with focus and priority on inclusion. And you can see based on the voting here, on a scale of 1 to 5, it was 4.5, out of 4.5 that folks felt that that vision statement aligned or related to you and your work, and which is great. But at the same time, we did ask for a little bit of, what's missing from this statement, or what would you change even if slightly. And we wanted to work with you all now in the large group through a Jamboard. So Roman, can you go to the next slide? I captured all of the feedback that was given in that survey. And actually, Roman, I'm going to share my screen. Let me get the Jamboard over in the right spot and make sure that you can all see it. Okay, so is everyone seeing something that looks like a whiteboard with stickies on it? Can I get a thumbs up?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. So this is the time in the meeting where I want you to unmute yourselves and kind of free flow. I know this is hard to read, so I will read it. I don't know how big it's appearing on your screen. I could zoom in a little bit. And so the feedback, I'm hungry. The feedback to that statement, that vision statement, included these things at the top, which were just kind of recommendations of how to change it. And that was include some reference to green or climate in the vision statement. How about paths to good careers? Ideally, it's not just getting people into jobs, but allowing them to continually advance. Be explicit about barriers intentionally erected for certain populations, including justice-involved people with disabilities, immigrants, justice-involved people with disabilities, immigrants, indigenous peoples, and Black populations, etc. Buzzword inclusion has become meaningless with extractive and exploitive corporations writing it into their corporate mission statements. Missing the green element suggests with focus and priority on the green economy and equitable outcomes. Designed with participation of representatives from the priority populations informing the process. Somebody noted that they were unclear on what priority meant here. Somebody recommended to include worker power unionization, and there was a thought that it's missing how we will intersect with existing paths. So then down here on the green stickies, this was also feedback, but it was more like, this is how you should edit it. It was like a direct recommendation. So one recommendation was, we are working to build consistent opportunities for a current and emerging workforce with a focus and priority on inclusion, protects the dignity of all individuals, and provides sustainable career paths. Somebody wanted to make sure it said quality jobs where it said good jobs, so include the word quality. Another recommendation to have in the green economy in there. And a complete recommendation, we are working to build consistent career paths to good jobs in the green economy with focus and priority and inclusion. And somebody else recommended to also add equity and sustainability at the end. So let me just zoom back out. So that's all of the feedback. And what I would like from all of you, I'm going to share a different Jamboard now. Are you seeing one that has a blank space at the top? Okay, so if all of you can just take a moment to think about that feedback and think about the vision statement, and just do a little bit of like wordsmithing on your own. Feel free to put things in chat while you're thinking, or say them out loud. And as you say them out loud, I will show you like whatever your input here. We will create a new row for a revised vision statement that will not have typos like that one does. So feel free now, think about this feedback, think about the vision statement and what we want it to state. This is an important statement for the Green Economy Network. It'll go hand in hand with our mission that we'll be creating over the next month and a half with the working groups. And I'll be quiet while you think for a moment and add to chat.
Carrie, if I could pipe up out loud for a moment.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm the one who wrote that cryptic heady thing about inclusion. And just to explain myself a little bit, to give an example, Walmart now has inclusion in its vision statement. Mm-hmm. I just don't, unless you have an actual explanation or description of what that means for this network, it can just be, it's just so diluted. I'm not sure that it actually really conveys much anymore. So that was why I gave that feedback. And I would encourage maybe the group or, to think about what inclusion actually means and to, what is the priority, what is the theme that is actually motivating that word instead of the word itself. So that was where that feedback came from.
And then for the 6640, we're gonna have a meeting with Pinkerton and we'll push that along.
I think my initial question, hi guys, I'm from Cypress Hills, where we write path to good jobs. I think it's actually defining, is there a way to actually define what the good jobs are? Because if we just say, hey, we want to have a good job, for some, it's like, oh, it's just the minimum wage and there's no mobility and there's no growth. And so is there a way to define, the word good, where it's more, I think with the vision statement, it shouldn't be not vague, but like it shouldn't be where people are like, oh, let me just do the bare minimum, versus actually saying we want, to build career paths to this type of jobs, whereas, we want full-time paying jobs, we want like benefits, we want growth. We don't have to say all those words, but like I feel like just saying good jobs, it's hard to define exactly like what is a good job. Like that's my first question. Like, what does that mean to be a good job?
Yeah, so thank you. And there's been a lot written about that, and we can take some time in a session to really look at how, after speaking with job seekers and working people, what a good job means to them. I think our field and our sector has kind of defined what we think a good job is, but it's not always the same thing that job seekers and workers say. We will talk about like consistent schedules and all sorts of things that sometimes some workers say, yes, that means a good job to me. And some workers say, no, I don't want a consistent schedule. I need a varied schedule. There's a variety of things. And there's a really good paper put out a few years ago, the Pinkerton Papers, that we could circulate, that talked about this. What is a good job? And includes feedback from people, the people who we serve and place in employment. So that's a great point, and something we should all kind of do a little bit of reading on, so we could come back together around how we're defining a good job.
Yeah, Carrie, I would add in that, so much around what a good job is and have had these conversations. I think that if we're looking at the Green Economy Network as being a like collaboration of employers and it's a conglomerate of making sure that, to your point, that what a good job is for an employee versus a like workforce provider versus an employer, wanting to be clear of like what we're considering. Just because there is such variation, and I know that we've been a part of these conversations, just wanting us all to be on the same page as a network.
Thank you. So any additional input that needs to be considered? Do you think with the feedback that is here, the edits that are here, is there a recommendation from this group on how the vision statement should read, knowing that the vision statement isn't going to define, every element of what's in here? We have to come to some agreement around terminology or remove it if it's, if we feel like it's too, if it's become meaningless, like Gaspar is talking about the word inclusion, has that word become meaningless because it is overused and used by corporations that we don't feel necessarily know what it means? I read something recently that we need to stop using inclusion and, kind of just start with a new table where everyone is sitting at the table, quote unquote, the table. Like, it's the word inclusion is maybe implying that somebody is deciding you are included. But how do you, tear it all down and start with a table that everyone has a seat at? So I don't have the answer for how this should read. I read that to all of you. And I cannot look at chat while I'm in here. So if people have put any recommendations in chat, feel free to say it out loud.
What if we
I think my guiding
populations? Sorry, Gaspar.
No, it's okay. I think my guiding comment on inclusion might be who do we want to include and what are we trying to include them into? And that'll clarify that specific element of the goal, and could also nail the good jobs concern. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I was looking up which companies have diversity, equity, inclusion in their vision statements, and includes, Walmart, Target, just, talk about lack of inclusion and sustainability, diversity. It's just painful. So that's where this is coming from.
So just as a process note, I agree with a lot of statements that are being made, but a vision statement is supposed to be one sentence, okay? And sometimes it's really difficult to find a better word, and we accept a generally acceptable word. And then later in goals and objectives, because like Casper, I think you're absolutely right. Some of your points are well taken. Got to find a way to define it all in a much better way. But I think what happens is if you don't have a simple vision statement, people get lost. Now, like words like good are problematic, and I think that has to be changed because good is so subjective. But I just want to make sure that we don't over define the vision statement and people don't really capture the essence of it and then move to the goals and objectives and all the important notes that you pointed out. I just think, just as a note, process note.
I agree with David. It would be like, let's keep it simple and concise, but I would say words like good and like inclusion, like just saying that, those are kind of triggering words where it's like, okay, what do you mean by that? Like, so maybe it's just using a different, I guess, less problematic word. But I think one thing to pay attention is that we do keep it concise, so that when we get to the goals part, we can actually be like, this is what we meant by this word, this is what we meant by here, and this is what we're working towards. But so for good jobs, I would say like to create jobs with longevity, that are resilient for the future.
Okay. This is great. I mean, obviously we could sit and probably wordsmith this for a long time. And ultimately, I think we can push all of this feedback, which is really helpful, to the working groups, where there'll be a smaller group of people who could kind of wordsmith it, think about, what's the right way to state the vision, and then share it back out to the full group for agreement. So thank you. And I know a bunch of you put some stuff in the chat, and we will make sure to capture everything that's in there into the Jamboard document and share it out with the working group who will work on this. So if there is something that you want to have included in the vision statement and haven't had a chance to speak up, just put it in the chat and it will be captured. All right, thanks. And let me look at the agenda. I think, Dave, you're back up to go over the partnership models.
Yes, thanks, Carrie. So perfect. So we're going to talk briefly about working groups and partnership models, and then we will split into some breakout rooms and have discussion about how to put together all the things that we've just been talking about over the past 20 minutes or so. So in previous surveys, many of you saw, we asked people to assign what we just lovingly called working group points to among different potential working groups. So as we've said from the very beginning, the idea is that ultimately the members of GEN take over the actual product, the work product, meaningful product of the system, so that ultimately all of you are going to create things that make this GEN network important in the first place. So looking at the responses, there was one very obvious winner, the employer partnerships. But and then after that, there was a mix of responses. So looking at the points, we came down to 4 groups: employer partnership and economic opportunities, policy and advocacy, strategy, which includes planning, network sustainability, management, some other more mundane things, and training and wraparound services, which includes bridge programs, quality of training, etc. So if we go to the next slide, we can see some of the average weighting for this, number of responses. We had dozens of responses, so that was good to see. If we go to the next slide. So again, these were the big ones. We asked people, besides what they wanted to see as the priority working groups, we also asked people which working groups they wanted to lead. Thankfully, we got several volunteers to lead various groups. Next slide, please. So when we're going to talk about in the breakout groups, how we can actually have how the working groups should structure themselves and work within their own groups, how those working groups are then going to work best or could work best with Gen as a whole, and how the working groups and Gen as a whole can create partnerships with external entities, whether that's their NGOs or government or private companies, and how all of this together is can best be used to turn those goals into targets and the targets into reality. So we're going to look at some sample partnership models, and again, for some of you, this can be familiar. If you go to the next slide. Now, none of these here are in any way partnership models that anyone has to use. This is just to get people starting to think about some potential partnership models that other organizations and companies have used. I'm not going to go into these super long at all, but just thinking about what the connection is between individuals or individual entities within working in network. So say individual working groups within the network, and what the connection is between the internal entities and the external entities. Feel free to use any of these as a starting point or to ignore them entirely and just free flow from wherever your group wants to go from. Go to the next slide. I won't go into this in detail at all, but just if anyone's curious about different ways that different organizations have used or have changed partnership models, there are some good examples that we can think of. And in the interest of time, if anyone's more interested in those, we can follow up later with that. So we go to the next slide. So again, these were the 4 big groups that we were talking about in terms of the general layout, but these are not, again, not the ones that we will be using ourselves, but there's some overlap between how these are structured and what we'll likely end up doing. If we can go to the next slide. Again, won't cover this too much because I covered this earlier, but just a quick refresh on goals, driver diagrams, targets. Think about the target as the goal made more specific, and the driver diagram as a way to turn those targets into more specific sub-targets and more specific plans for becoming reality. Go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to go into some breakout groups in which we are going to hopefully design partnership models. And these, again, are not going to be set in stone, but really want us to think about how we're going to turn goals into targets, how we're going to turn our current one big group into several smaller working groups that actually focus on specific plans and projects, and how we're going to have those working groups turn those plans into things that they then connect with Gen as a whole, and how they connect with external entities, if that's part of what they intend to do.
Take it away.
All right. So just initially, the last thing we were just speaking about was kind of the structure for, I guess, the partnership and stuff. Because earlier we were shown 3 different types, which is the steering, full democracy, and then the one-to-many. But I think when I was discussing in the group, I don't know if it's we yet, I didn't get too much feedback, but we think that what makes sense, it might be a steering committee, because we are talking about subcommittees where, you know, it was mentioned about having an advisory council where we have the advisory councils for the end users and we have the advisory council for the employers. So these are conversations that, you know, these are, oh my God, I'm sorry, I'm going blank, guys. No, but so we have different like levels to it. Well, we'll have conversations with employers, we'll have conversations with our participants or whoever we're relating to, and then we're having our internal conversations. And the reason that I push for a steering committee is because sometimes we'll have new users, new people part of the network, like myself, I've been popping in randomly, but we have new people that come in randomly, and we want to make sure they're making an educated guess. They're not a guess, an educated vote, and are really a part of these. Like Yeah, so I'm so scatterbrained right now.
No, it's awesome. So
Go ahead.
Catherine recommended, yes, that's great. Let's go to the next group because we were able to capture some of what Catherine said in our worksheet. And the groups are going to continue filling in those worksheets. So room number 1 or 2.
That's Eric and myself. So we had some really great, I mean, kind of Elizabeth threw a wrench in it in terms of getting us to shift our mindset to think about. So we spent some time thinking about what's the core essence of the partnership. And she presented the opportunity to think about it as some sort of marketplace. So definitely sort of an interchangeable, an exchange where we kind of fill different seats. So we were talking about that and then thinking a little bit about, you know, our roles, but really what we got from it, and Eric was doing a great job summarizing it, is, you know, that we wanted more definition around key terms, that would really help in us having better conversations about what a model would look like. Because a lot of the group, you know, just as this, you know, I'm fairly new to everything, so I would love more definition, but really I think it's understanding our role and how we interact with each other and having those clearer definitions around inclusion, around jobs, and just the mission statement.
Awesome, thank you. Can someone from group 1 just share out?
Yeah, and just the last one was our group. We had similar discussions and just a great discussion about not just further understanding the ecosystem, but had some folks with us that you know, have been on both sides of our table in terms of workforce development providers and now employers. And so talking about what are the needs of this time, and how are we aligning our skills-based training and supports with those needs.
All right, thank you. I hope that everyone captured these ideas in those worksheets, and in the next month and a half, we are not having an August meeting. There's a lot of vacations coming up. September 20th, I think, is Climate Week. So we are asking you to please hold September 23rd, Thursday, from 10 to 12 for a Climate Week meeting and event with both presenters and this group, hopefully pulling together a lot of things between now and then. We're going to have working group meetings. Jobs First will be reaching out to you to help get that rolling, and also help planning with some conversations with other stakeholders like employers and job seekers, young adults, to get some additional input from other folks. So thank you all. Apologies for keeping you a couple of minutes over, and we will be in touch via email. We will redraft a vision statement and ask for your input on that, or both. So thank you so much. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of the week and has a wonderful weekend, and we will see you on email.
Thanks, Carrie.
Yeah, and before everyone leaves, just quickly wanted to highlight our Adapting the Event series, which is coming up. And I'm gonna have one of my colleagues just paste the information in the chat. So registration is now open. Adapting is one of Jobs First's premier events, which we have each year. We have a young adult day, and we also have a day for adults. So we're inviting you all to sign up for the adult day, and also to share this opportunity with any young adults that you might be serving, to invite them to the young adult day. And so there's more information in the chat. And we hope that you all will be able to join us for both days.
Thanks, Roman.
Thanks all for coming today. Bye.
Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks, Elizabeth. I think maybe left, and Marjorie.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Antoine, good to see you.
My pleasure. This was great. Enjoyed it.
All right. Talk to you soon.